What if I told you there was once a tree that helped shape the taste of American childhood, and that most people today barely remember it ever existed? It grew wild across much of eastern North America. Native peoples had trusted it for thousands of years. Colonial settlers once treated it like a treasure. By the early 20th century, it had become so familiar that root beer, spring tonics, and old kitchen traditions all carried its scent. Then, almost without warning, it vanished from everyday life. This was sassafras, the tree that once moved from forest medicine to colonial survival, from household remedy to national flavor. It was not erased because it failed. It was not forgotten because it had no value. In fact, its disappearance makes the story even more unsettling. A tree that had once been praised, exported, brewed, and passed down through generations suddenly became something people stopped using, stopped talking about, and eventually stopped recognizing. Within a single lifetime, it went from cultural memory to near silence. And that is what makes this story so powerful. Sassafras did not truly disappear. The tree kept growing. What disappeared was the knowledge around it, the habits, the trust, and the place it once held in American life. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to the beginning, long before the first Europeans ever set foot in North America. Long before Europeans ever saw sassafras, the tree was already deeply known across eastern North America. It grew from Maine down to Florida and stretched west toward eastern Texas, rooted across forests that indigenous peoples had lived with for generations beyond counting. Different communities knew it by different names, but the relationship was the same. This was not some obscure wild tree. It was recognized, used, and respected. Among peoples such as the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Timucua of Florida, sassafras held a place that crossed the boundaries between medicine, daily life, and survival itself. What made it so valuable was that nearly every part of the tree could be used. The roots were brewed into tea for fevers, colds, and what people understood as blood purification. The leaves were crushed and applied to wounds, sprains, and insect bites. The bark could be chewed for oral health, not just to freshen the breath, but because its oils helped fight bacteria. Long before modern toothpaste existed, people had already learned that the tree could help protect the mouth and ease discomfort. This was not a single-purpose plant. It was a complete resource, one that gave something useful from root to leaf to bark. Its importance went even further when people discovered what the leaves could become. Once dried and ground into powder, they turned into filet, a natural thickener for soups and stews. That knowledge would survive the centuries and later become essential to Louisiana Creole gumbo. In other words, sassafras did not just leave behind medicinal traditions. It also helped shape one of the most iconic food cultures in America. From the beginning, this tree was never just about healing. It was about nourishment, resilience, and inherited knowledge carried forward through everyday life. When Europeans began arriving in North America, they did not encounter sassafras as a curiosity. They encountered it as something people were already using with confidence. In times of hardship, that mattered immediately. Early English settlers reported that during periods of starvation, sassafras leaves were boiled and used to help people endure when other food was scarce. Spanish explorers in Florida had already learned from indigenous communities that the tree could be used for many different ailments. French visitors documented it, English settlers tested it, and before long, Europe realized that this was not just another unfamiliar plant from the New World. It was something people believed could be sold at extraordinary value. The timing could not have been more powerful. By the late 1500s, Europe was in the grip of a syphilis epidemic, and doctors had no reliable cure. Fear was everywhere, and so was desperation. Then reports began spreading about a tree from across the Atlantic whose roots and bark could purify the blood and treat disease. Whether those expectations were exaggerated or not, demand exploded. Sassafras entered Europe not simply as a botanical novelty, but as hope in a market driven by illness, panic, and the promise of healing. Apothecaries began selling it as a medicinal drink, prescribing it for fevers, digestive trouble, skin conditions, and pain. Its aroma alone helped build its reputation, making it feel exotic, powerful, and desirable. Very quickly, the price soared. Sassafras bark became so valuable that it was described as being worth its weight in gold. Expeditions were launched with the specific goal of finding and harvesting it. Ships returned loaded with bark and roots, and fortunes were made. For a time, sassafras rose into the center of the colonial economy, eventually becoming one of early America's largest exports after tobacco. But that success carried a dangerous cost. The more valuable the tree became, the more aggressively people stripped it from the land, setting up the next chapter of its story. The problem was simple and devastating. The most valuable part of sassafras was its bark, because that was where the highest concentration of its prized aromatic oil could be found. But harvesting the bark did not leave the tree standing. It killed it. Every shipment that crossed the Atlantic, every fortune made from its sale, came at the cost of another living tree stripped beyond recovery. What had begun as admiration quickly turned into extraction, and extraction turned into depletion. By the early 1600s, the pressure was already becoming obvious. Colonists could not keep up with export demands because so many of the most accessible sassafras trees had already been cut down or stripped to death. In only a few decades, a plant once seen as abundant was being driven toward near extinction in the very areas where traders could reach it most easily. This is one of the oldest patterns in colonial history. The moment something in the land becomes profitable, its survival becomes secondary to its market value. And yet sassafras did not disappear. The tree had a kind of stubborn resilience built into it. Its roots kept sending up new shoots. Its seeds remained buried in the soil, waiting. Even after intense harvesting, it continued to return, quietly from the ground upward. That resilience mattered, because without it, sassafras might have vanished long before it ever became part of American culture. Instead, it endured. Not untouched, not unharmed, but alive enough to enter a new chapter, one that would transform it from a colonial export into something much more familiar. By the 19th century, sassafras was no longer just a colonial export or a remembered medicinal tree. Americans had found a new way to bring it into daily life. Its root could be turned into a sweet, fizzy drink, and that discovery changed everything. Root beer was born, and with it sassafras entered a new phase of its story. It was no longer simply something gathered from the forest or sold through apothecaries. It became part of ordinary culture, part of taste, memory, and comfort. By the turn of the 20th century, sassafras had woven itself into American life so completely that it felt permanent. Root beer was sold in stores across the country. Grandmothers still brewed sassafras tea as a spring tonic. Southern kitchens kept filet powder close at hand for gumbo. The tree existed at the intersection of folk medicine, home cooking, and commercial success. It carried the weight of tradition while also becoming a modern product. That rare combination is part of what made it so powerful. Sassafras was not confined to one class, one region, or one purpose. It moved easily between the pantry, the porch, the pharmacy, and the marketplace. Its cultural reach was reinforced by the names attached to it. George Washington drank it, Benjamin Franklin praised it, Thomas Jefferson served it, and later Charles Hyers transformed root beer into a commercial empire, marketing it as a wholesome alternative to alcohol. By then, the smell and taste of sassafras had become something more than flavor. They had become familiar, almost emotional, tied to the feeling of home and the memory of childhood. For a while, it seemed that sassafras had secured its place forever in American culture. But that illusion would not last. Then came the break. In 1960, the FDA announced that saffrole, the compound responsible for sassafras's distinctive aroma and flavor, had caused liver cancer in laboratory rats. The finding landed with enormous force. Very quickly, saffrole was banned from commercially mass-produced foods and drugs, and the effect was immediate. Root beer manufacturers had to reformulate. Some replaced the original flavor with artificial alternatives. Others used processed sassafras, extract with the saffrole removed entirely. The industry survived, but the tradition did not. That is what made this moment so decisive. Commercial root beer could still exist, but real sassafras, the thing that had given it its identity, was pushed out. The old homemade teas began disappearing from kitchens. Herbalists stopped recommending it. Pantry traditions tied to sassafras weakened or were altered. What had once been ordinary suddenly became suspicious. And once a plant is marked that way, The cultural damage moves faster than the scientific debate ever can. People do not wait for nuance when they hear the word cancer. They stop using, stop trusting, and stop passing knowledge down. Within a generation, that shift was complete. Most Americans no longer knew sassafras as a living tree with a long history of use. They knew root beer as a factory-made flavor and nothing more. A plant that had once moved through medicine, cooking, commerce, and memory was now being pushed out of public life. But the deeper question begins here. Was this really only about health, or was something larger starting to take shape behind the ban? At first, the official explanation seemed straightforward. Saffrol had been linked to cancer in laboratory rats, so the government moved to remove it from commercial foods and drugs. But the deeper problem begins when you look more closely at the scale of those experiments. The rats were given amounts so extreme that the comparison to normal human use became deeply distorted. According to the argument laid out in the source, the dosage was closer to the equivalent of drinking around 32 bottles of root beer every single day for months. That was not ordinary consumption. That was a laboratory scenario pushed to an extreme. And once that detail enters the picture, another contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Saffrol is not found only in sassafras. It also appears in nutmeg, black pepper, cinnamon, star anise, and basil. In fact, the source argues that nutmeg contains even more saffrol than sassafras does. Yet those ingredients were not pushed out of everyday life in the same way. They remained on the store shelves, in spice racks, and in ordinary kitchens without carrying the same cultural stigma. So the question becomes unavoidable. If saffrol itself was the true issue, why was sassafras treated so differently from the other familiar plants that also contain it? That is where the story begins to shift. By the 1960s and 1970s, saffrol was no longer just a flavor compound or an herbal concern. It had become something else in the eyes of the state, a chemical precursor that could be used in the production of illegal drugs. And once that happened, sassafras was no longer being judged only as a traditional tree. It was being pulled into an entirely different system, one built around surveillance, enforcement, and control. By the time the war on drugs expanded in the 1970s, saffrol had taken on a completely different meaning. It was no longer seen only as the aromatic compound that gave sassafras its unmistakable flavor. It was now understood as a chemical precursor, something that underground chemists could use to produce MDA and MDMA, the substances later known widely as ecstasy and Molly. That changed the entire framework. The issue was no longer just food safety or traditional use. It became a matter of law enforcement. From that point on, sassafras entered a battle it had never belonged to. The tree itself could not realistically be banned. It was native to eastern North America and grew wild across a vast region. It was too widespread, too natural, too deeply rooted in the landscape to erase. But what authorities could do was target saffrol as a controlled chemical concern. In other words, they could not remove the tree from the forest, but they could remove its legitimacy from public life. Once that happened, sassafras stopped being treated primarily as a traditional plant and started being viewed through the lens of potential criminal use. That shift created the central irony of the whole story. A tree that indigenous peoples had used safely for thousands of years was now overshadowed by what someone with chemistry equipment might do with it. Its older identity as medicine, flavor, and cultural inheritance became secondary to its newer identity as a possible drug precursor. And once that happened, the distance between the American people and sassafras grew even wider. The tree was still there, but the meaning attached to it had changed completely. Once sassafras was pushed out of everyday life, what disappeared was not just the original taste of root beer. What disappeared was an entire chain of practical knowledge that had survived for generations. Traditionally, sassafras root tea had been used as a spring tonic and as a blood purifier, especially after the long winter months. Modern analysis, as described in the source, points to compounds in the plant with real anti-inflammatory properties. That matters because it suggests this was not simply a case of old folklore surviving through sentiment. At least part of that tradition rested on observable chemistry. The leaves carried their own value. They contained mucilage, the same kind of soothing substance found in plants long used to calm irritation in the throat and digestive system. That helps explain why native communities use sassafras for digestive discomfort and why the bark was chewed to soothe the mouth and throat. Filet powder made from the dried leaves was more than just a culinary trick. It contributed nutrients and became essential to Creole gumbo after West African, Native American, and European traditions blended in Louisiana. Even sassafras twigs once served as a form of natural dental care before petroleum-based toothpaste became the norm. And then there is the part the source presents as especially provocative. The suggestion that saffrole in very small amounts may even have protective effects against certain cancers rather than simply causing them. Whether that claim is ultimately embraced or not, the point is clear. The public did not just lose access to a flavor. It lost a plant that had once connected medicine, food, and inherited cultural memory in one continuous tradition. What makes the story even stranger is that sassafras never truly disappeared. It still grows wild across much of the eastern United States, from Maine down through Texas, quietly remaining in the same forests where it has stood for centuries. In autumn, its leaves turn vivid shades of yellow, orange, and burgundy. It is easy to recognize once you know what to look for, especially because a single tree can carry three distinct leaf shapes at once: oval, mitten-shaped, and three-lobed. The tree is still there, still rooted in the landscape, untouched by the forgetting that happened around it. And legally, the picture is more complicated than most people assume. According to the source, it is not illegal to possess a sassafras tree or to harvest it for personal use. The real restrictions focus on the commercial sale, import, and distribution of saffron-containing products. That distinction matters because it reveals how the line was drawn. The tree itself was not erased from the land. What was erased was its accepted place in public commerce and mainstream culture. Some people still forage sassafras roots and brew tea the old way, using it sparingly and traditionally rather than in extreme amounts. Others buy saffron-free extracts online, though those processed versions are not the same as the original. So the final image is almost haunting. The forests never gave sassafras up. The roots kept growing, the seeds kept sleeping in the soil, and each spring the tree returned as it always had. What vanished was not the plant, but the willingness of society to keep recognizing its place. Sassafras did not stop offering what it had always offered. People simply stopped looking. In the end, the story of sassafras is not just about a tree. It is about who gets to decide which knowledge is trusted, which traditions are allowed to survive, and which parts of cultural memory are quietly pushed aside. Indigenous peoples had used sassafras safely for thousands of years. For centuries, it remained woven into American life through medicine, cooking, trade, and tradition. Then, in the span of just a few decades, it was pushed out of mainstream use and nearly erased from public memory. Not because the tree was gone, and not simply because people stopped needing it, but because the systems defining what counted as acceptable knowledge had changed. That is why this story feels larger than sassafras itself. Once regulation, drug enforcement, and commercial reformulation moved in the same direction, the older relationship between people and the plant began to collapse. Elders who still remembered drinking real sassafras tea grew older and died. Recipes stopped being passed down. Children grew up tasting root beer without ever knowing it once came from an actual root in the ground. In only one or two generations, a living tradition that had lasted for thousands of years was reduced to a faint historical trace. That is how forgetting works. It does not always happen through force alone. Sometimes it happens by making something seem outdated, risky, or inconvenient until people abandon it on their own. And yet the story does not end in total loss. Sassafras is still here. The tree still grows. The knowledge, however damaged, is not completely gone. What remains is a choice. Whether people leave that knowledge buried beneath regulation and cultural amnesia, or whether they begin to look again at what earlier generations understood. Because sassafras never stopped offering what it had always offered. America simply stopped remembering how to receive it.